Leading a sector is tough but manageable, but developing leadership that can overcome sectoral interests to advance the national interests beyond sectarian divisions is tough. Tonight, we look at what kind of leadership South Africa requires to deal with its many issues, from a stagnant economy to fighting state capture and endemic violence.
I think what we set out to do and to achieve as a summit has been achieved. Now what remains is that we must go and do the work.
Then we unpack the Job Summit, held as the start of a new social compact built between all partners at great fanfare. But what if critical sectors were not represented? Just how are they going to be committed to its outcomes? Our expert panel looks at the challenge of implementing a far from perfect set of goals aimed at denting unemployment. The Fix starts now. This is The Fix, where every Sunday night, without fear or favor, we question the big hitters. We will look ahead to tell you what matters, how it affects you, and why you should care. And as usual, with me is my sparring partner, Sunday Times and Business Day columnist Peter Bruce. Peter, good evening. Welcome.
Nice to see you again. And as we speak, right? Breaking news, people. As we speak, there is a meeting going on a certain buffalo ranch, large one, I can assure you, in Limpopo. And the future of a very important man in our government is being discussed.
Absolutely, Peter. As we were obviously looking at the fate of Nhlanhla Nene subsequent to his apology for meeting with the Guptas, it has now emerged that the African National Congress's top six are gathered in Limpopo ahead of its National Working Committee discussing most likely the fate of Mr. Nene. Some have indicated that he's going to fall on his own sword, but apparently the president is quite furious with the fact that Nhlanhla Nene had never shared that he had in fact not met with the Guptas once but several times.
Yeah. Look, I'm absolutely positive that he will already have offered to resign. That would be the code of honor amongst people like that. And you know, if you're the Minister of Dingbats, maybe you think you can hang on in there. But at this level, your word is your bond on a lot of the things that you decide, not only politically with your president or your cabinet colleagues, but with the international markets as well. And he's been caught wanting, and it's an absolute tragedy because he's a nice man and he was a good finance minister, but he's a political liability now.
Absolutely, and also a liar, because he didn't tell his cabinet colleagues what had really happened. In fact, I spoke to officials in the Treasury during the week after he stunned the commission. That he had met with the Zondo Commission. And they said up until they were drafting his statement, they had not known that he had met with him in all.
There's a clip somewhere, isn't there, of an ENCA interview he did after he was fired. Do we?
Absolutely. Let's have a listen to Siphamandla Kokwe, our reporter, speaking to Mr. Nene, and Mr. Nene, of course, completely denying the kind of relationship he now owed up to.
Look, I bumped into them in public gatherings once or twice, but I've never had an engagement, and I've never been asked by them to do anything for them.
Yeah, well, I'm afraid that is a lie.
Absolutely.
And you know what he told Judge Zondo, and then what he came out and told again in the apology, completely contradicts that.
Absolutely.
A finance minister in a responsible country cannot survive that. End of story.
Absolutely not. Let's have a look at what Minister Nene told the Zondo Commission eventually.
In my own contact with the Guptas, I did meet the Gupta family, particularly Mr. Ajay Gupta, at a number of occasions, government events. They were regular attendees at government events at that time, but not to discuss government business, because that's generally what normally comes up. There is a dinner that takes place after the State of the Nation address. That was my first encounter in 2009, and I was Deputy Minister of Finance at that time. But then later invited, well, there would also be other functions, which I cannot remember properly. But I was later invited to the Sahara Computers offices in Midrand. He then invited me to tea at his house to discuss the economy because of his understanding.
Yeah. So tea in Saxon world, the Saxon world should be in. Not good enough. Just not good enough. And it was, you know, he clearly lied to the original interviewer. But he was doing a reasonable job. He wasn't sort of, knocking the lights out necessarily. But Cyril Ramaphosa now has to find somebody real fast to replace him.
Yes, word that is going around in the corridor, Peter, is that the finance MEC for Gauteng, which is of course South Africa's powerhouse, Barbara Creecy, is somebody that is being considered.
We'll all be Googling her after this. What do you know about her? Does she have a does she have a faction?
Well, firstly, she has an incredibly long history in the African National Congress. Barbara Creecy was involved since her student days at university. So she's come through the ranks, and she's been a cadre of the African National Congress for a very long time. Now, if you are in Gauteng, you can't be a politician without a faction. Here, the ruling faction, the so-called Alex Mafia, has been in charge for a very long time.
Paul Mashatile.
Mr. Mashatile.
Are they so bad?
Well, the thing is that dynamics have changed now. We've seen, of course, Mr. Mashatile moving on to bigger, brighter things, national politics. And, of course, we have now got Mr. Makura, David Makura, who's the Premier and the Chairperson of the province. And most importantly...
He seems a perfectly nice man. He was just with us a few weeks ago.
Absolutely. I think what is interesting about Barbara Creecy is the fact that she's obviously held the reins of the country's largest economic province. And I suppose...
So she'd have some...
If you need to look internally, that ought to be one of it. She's also been elected to the National Executive Committee of the African National Congress, so her stature in the party has also gone up.
But would he survive appointing a white finance minister? And would she be a temporary holder of the job until come an election where he can have a wider cabinet reshuffle?
Look, it's interesting because it depends on the politics of the African National Congress. The ANC is, in terms of its principles, meant to be a non-racial organization. It had Ruth First as a member. It had Frini Jinwala as a member. So the fact that Barbara Creecy is white and a female shouldn't count in terms of the historic mission of the African National Congress. But the fact it does count, as you rightly know, there's a large section that refers to coloureds and whites as minorities in the ANC. So that might be one of the objections, and it might throw some other hats in the rings there.
So, but he doesn't have much. I reckon he's got to have this done and dusted by the end of tomorrow, if not by the beginning of tomorrow.
Absolutely.
It's too important, and the markets will open. And if there's any uncertainty, we absolutely just don't need this now.
No, the president cannot appear to not be in charge. Not at this stage. He emerged out of the Job Summit, which we'll be discussing later. He needs to be in charge driving this program.
Well, it's good to see that they're meeting on his farm at, in his place. And they've gone all the way. It's a long way away.
Yes. Absolutely.
Karima, you raised something earlier on before we started the show about there's this protest to sort of shut down almost everything, right, sometime this week. And it seems to involve coloured communities that are marginalised and kind of basically invisible.
Yes.
And I've been reading your posts. I absolutely don't understand the issue. And I want you to explain to people, or me, what is happening.
You know, you often ask me, what does the ANC mean when they say the national question? And this is precisely what it comes down to. The reality is that apartheid was a staggered and caste system. So it oppressed different black African people in different ways. And of course, as a consequence of that, there is a sense that some benefit even whilst they were oppressed. So, for example, you would have Cape Town having a Cape Labour preference market where you wouldn't have people from...
but that was all invented by the colonials. I mean, they did that. They did it all over the world.
You would have the Free State as a place where Indians, for example, couldn't live, work or trade. And so in the fight against apartheid, there was this kind of siloed approach where people, particularly in the ANC or Congress tradition, spoke about Africans in particular, blacks in general, and blacks in general meant to Indians and coloreds. But increasingly, as Tony Ehrenreich began to raise, is that this question or this approach of looking at communities of mixed heritage de-Africanizes them, because their roots are as African as everybody else's. The African National Congress defines an African as having any family who has at least one forebear coming from this continent. And so the way in which people have been experiencing things like affirmative action and so on has been an issue. And of course, a lot of people self-identify as colored. We saw it on TV. But the point that I made in my Facebook post, Peter, was that people can be more than one thing at a time. And the class dynamic of this conflict is not focused on. So when ratepayers in Soweto fight squatters on unoccupied land, then people talk about the fact that they are protecting their property. But when it happens in the Western Cape, the question is seen only in a raced manner. And I was calling for a more complex understanding of some of these issues.
How does this protest end?
Well, traditionally, you would have your parties like the DA and so on. We see the mobilization of people along ethnic lines. But these communities are people who used to be involved in things like the UDF, and they are basically saying to all political parties, we're not going to be your football unless you deliver services. We are not going to be engaged. They're calling for an anti-poverty summit, and I think it's going to be interesting to see how the government is going to respond to it. Well, still up ahead on the fix, we unpack the feasibility and the implementation of the Jobs Summit with my expert panel. See you after the break.